For this weekend's Shipwreck video, we'll be doing two things. First, continuing my overall look at Nautilus surveys. And secondly, doing my first video on their work this month. July 2025, as of this upload. There's no shortage of material to work with, even with the unfortunate breakdown of their ROV equipment. 11 wrecks were surveyed in detail, counting New Orleans' bow. Of those, I chose to begin with the wreck in by far the worst condition, the Japanese destroyer Yudachi, a ship that I covered relatively recently. Her wreck was first located by Robert Ballard back in the 1990s. At the time, the wreck was in rough shape, but still largely recognizable. The bridge was collapsing to port, and the stern had been blown apart by a magazine detonation. The tip of the bow had also fallen away. On the other hand, the torpedo tubes were largely intact, and the bridge was still recognizable. And more importantly, still attached to the ship. The wreck that Nautilus surveyed 3 decades later is by far worse off. All of the wrecks they surveyed showed increased deterioration. How much, varying based on when the wreck was last surveyed. With 30 years of accumulated rusting, Yudachi's condition isn't exactly surprising. But it is striking. If any wreck looks like a grave, it's Yudachi. Which is ironic, I suppose, for a ship that had most of the crew pulled off before she was sunk. That aside, since I've already covered Yudachi, I won't touch much on her sinking here. It came at the end of a chaotic action on November 13th, 1942, the first phase of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Exactly what Yudachi got up to in that battle varies wildly depending on which source you use. A true sign of how chaotic that mess really was. Combined Fleet is, as always, going to be your go-to source. I'll link their article in the description. In any case, Yudachi was sunk early in the morning on November 13th, 1942. USS Portland, crippled and sailing in circles, sank the abandoned ship. Yudachi went down with 26 of her crew, lost in the nighttime battle, while 207 were pulled off prior to the destroyer being abandoned. At this point, Yudachi vanished beneath the waves for decades. It was only in 1992 that her wreck was located by the aforementioned survey conducted by Robert Ballard. As I noted before, at the time, the wreck was still largely recognizable. Unfortunately, not much material was released from that survey, which is why I hadn't covered her wreck until now. The more recent Nautilus survey on July 9th, 2025 gave much more material. Not a surprise, as they live-streamed the entire affair. Unfortunately, while there's plenty of material, not much of it is recognizable. Yudachi is falling apart far more rapidly than any other wreck in the area. At least the wrecks that were surveyed by Nautilus. I should note this is not surprising. What most sources agree on with Yudachi is that she burnt badly and was shot up badly as well. Both of these contribute to rapid rusting, as well as the fact that Japanese ships generally rust faster than American ones. And it was 30 years, which is quite a gap between surveys. So no, I'm not surprised by the condition, other than in just how bad it's actually become. Yudachi's relatively shallow depth likely isn't helping matters either. I haven't been able to find reference to her exact depth, not even in Ballard's book. However, she went down in the same general area as USS Laffey, so we can extrapolate from there. Laffey is resting at around 800 meters, or 2,624 feet. Yudachi should be in the same ballpark. Not shallow, but far from the deepest wreck out there. Now, with all of that covered, let's look at what Nautilus found. As is tradition, I'll do this in stages. We'll start with the weaponry, then the superstructure, such as it is, and then the hull. Fair warning, this will be on the longer side. There is a lot to touch on here. With this in mind, let's start with the torpedo tubes. As a Shiratsuyu-class destroyer, Yudachi carried 2 quadruple mounts. Both of those were carried amidships, with one between the funnels and the other behind the aft funnel. On the wreck today, they're some of the only recognizable features as a result. As we'll see, basically everything aft of the second mount is gone. Although, as with everything on this wreck, recognizable is a matter of perspective. Here we have the forward torpedo tubes from relatively far out. Already you can faintly see how bad the damage to the ship is. And the tubes themselves, a lump of metal. It's worth noting in 1992, the mounts still looked a bit more like they did on the surface. The tubes still stuck out, and the mounting was more recognizable in general. That isn't the case now. You can actually see one of the outer portion of the tubes here. The rest are missing. Going closer in doesn't exactly look much better. The top of the mount has completely rusted away, leaving nothing but twisted metal behind. A scattering of unrecognizable debris, from pipes here to various chunks of rusted metal. It is not pretty. Even the larger pieces such as this are completely unrecognizable at this point. That piping to the side might be the remnants of one of the masts, but I really can't say. There's just not enough left to say for sure. Regardless, as we move along, we come to where the tubes fell free of the mount. And there's that covering here that we saw earlier. However, the by far more distinctive bit is just in front of the mount. You can start to see it here, a crumpled in deck with the ship punched in by fallen debris. Here, well, that's much more apparent. More of the torpedo tube debris is here. It's crushed in the entire deck, with the forward superstructure falling apart ahead of it. We'll return to that in a bit. First, the mount. Looking at it from the front isn't much better. While Ballard's book didn't give context on which tubes he was looking at, that mount was upright and mostly intact. That isn't the case here. The mount has fallen to the side and the deck collapsed beneath it. Furthermore, the exterior portion of the tubes are gone. They've all fallen in a heap on the deck, with this one in particular falling through the deck, exposing piping, among other things. I'm impressed that the metal hasn't rusted through, but that doesn't change the damage. Although it does give an excellent look inside the mount, so there's that. Not something I can think of on any other Japanese wreck. For its part, the aft mount is little better. It follows more or less the same pattern of damage, collapsing into the deck with the exterior portion of the tubes falling away. The deck is a bit better though, at least towards the bow. As you can see here, it's not nearly as punched in. There's certainly holes. One here, and in a slightly different angle, one here. But those holes are nowhere near as bad, although the mount itself is arguably worse off. It's collapsed in the center, and very visibly so. Not to mention, more of the outer plating has rusted away. Now, part of this is almost certainly down to the aft portion of the mount. This is just ahead of where Yudachi's stern was blown off, and much of the deck has been quite literally peeled up and over the torpedo tubes. You can see it here, along with the top of the mount. It's rough to say the least. Meanwhile, looking over the tubes toward the bow gives an excellent view at where they broke apart. That said, it also wraps up the torpedo tubes. Now we'll look at the one confirmed turret still more or less on the wreck. Going back to Ballard's initial survey, that had been upright and still fixed in place on the wreck. The barrels were pointing up, but the turret was otherwise intact. That is very much not the case anymore. The turret has completely fallen off the ship, landing on its side. That would have been bad enough, but the thin steel has also largely rusted away. The turret roof is almost completely gone. Only some skeletal framework and rusted chunks remain. Admittedly, this gives a good look inside, just like on Canberra, but there's not much to see. The breech of the guns can be faintly seen here, but the rest of the internals are seemingly gone, either buried or rusted away. Looking from above here doesn't reveal much more, just the mud on the bottom and more of the rusted steel. And similarly, looking closer in doesn't change things either. We get a better look at the gun breech, though details are impossible to make out. It also shows the rust pattern pretty well, where the surviving chunks are clinging on for dear life. On the other hand, the barrels are still mostly fine. One is pointing up, the other is more flat. Both remain in place despite the damage. I suppose when you move out, things don't look quite so bad. You can see the overall shape of the turret better, as well as the full extent of the guns. It still isn't exactly well preserved by any stretch, but at least it looks better. The same could be said for the fronts of the turret. While the barrels are pretty well covered in coral, the front isn't rusted out nearly as bad as the roof. The relatively thicker steel has held up better, just like the turret's sides. However, when you move around those barrels, things get bad once more, because you can see the remnants of the deck with the turret bottom slowly rusting away from it. Despite this, when the turret fell to the side, it took a good chunk of the deck with it. From this angle, you can really see the chunk torn from the destroyer. And from this angle, well, you've got the remnants of Yudachi's deck. Not much left here at all. Scattered debris, piping, and the turret to the side, including the part that would normally be hidden below the deck here. The entire structure, above and below the deck, has fallen to the side, leaving a massive crater in the destroyer. Regardless, that wraps up the confirmed turret. Towards the stern, Nautilus found what might be the remains of one of the aft turrets. It's roughly the right shape and has what looks like a barrel poking out. You can see that better in this picture and this one as well. But the actual turret, if that's what this is, has been completely torn apart. So that could just be some barrel-shaped debris instead. It's tough to say. Either way, with that wrapping up the weaponry, it's time to move on to the superstructure, or what's left of it. First, we have this bit just ahead of the torpedo tubes. From the overall position, I'd guess this is the remnants of the forward funnel. It would match the overall shape and position. In addition, aside from the mast, there's not really anything in terms of superstructure before the bridge. Aside from the funnel, which, if that's what this is, I'm impressed it has survived at all, even if there's not much left, either from behind here or from above here, where the funnel shape is much more apparent, at least to my eye. Looking closer in here, there's various bits of debris scattered about the funnel. None of it is particularly recognizable, something that doesn't change when you move out ahead. The only difference is a davit here, along with the overall shape more closely matching the funnel, again to my eye. However, without much else to touch on, let's move on. First here, where the hull has broken. The plating is buckled out and rusting away, while the degaussing line has fallen. Although what matters here is what's above it. The first bit of the bridge fallen away to port. From the aft portion, there's not really much. A box here and a bunch of loose wiring and the like. The rest has collapsed and isn't recognizable. Not from here and not from here further up. It's a good example of the deterioration, but not much else. The forward end of the bridge, on the other hand, is where things get recognizable. Just like in 1992, the roof is gone. But the voice tubes and other bridge equipment are still largely intact, even if it has fallen over. In the 90s, Ballard noted that the bridge was tilted to port. In 2025, it's fallen to port. That does give us a good look inside. As noted, the voice tubes are quite clear. Those were used for communicating from the bridge and are still mostly intact, covered in silt and the like, but recognizable. There's also a gauge here. The numbers are pretty clear once you really get close in. I'm not sure what this was for, but it's impressively intact regardless. Even if the rest of the bridge around it definitely isn't. For example, we have where it's fallen from the deck here. It's torn away, though it hasn't torn up the deck near as badly as the turret. Not to say the deck is great, because it's not. The deck has collapsed pretty badly to starboard, just that the bridge hasn't torn a giant chunk off like the turret. On that subject, we get another look at that turret break here, from the turret itself to where it tore the deck open. However, that said, we finished the superstructure now. We'll round off the video with the hull, though this is where things are by far the worst. The bow, for example, is gone. In 1992, this was torn off and fallen to the side. But, at least from what the book said, it was still intact. That isn't the case anymore. The tip of the bow is still there, but behind it, everything is either rusted away or flattened into the bottom. You can clearly see that from this angle. The bow has completely collapsed, leaving flat metal behind the tip. Whatever caused the bow to break in the first place did a number on it. The internal framework is gone, leaving just the flat plating. And when you move towards the stern, it doesn't exactly get better. The deck is gone, leaving nothing but what might be a rangefinder recognizable. Otherwise, it's just a little of the hull. That isn't surprising, I suppose, because the starboard side is mostly gone for a good chunk of the ship. You can start to see that here, but it becomes even more apparent as we move on. Here, for instance, there's only a small bit left. There's more here, but not by much. And where the turret fell away, the ship is basically gone above the seabed. From where the deck was torn away with the turret to where it's collapsed inward here. And you can tell it fell inward because there's a porthole. While a bit further back you can see more portholes and a davit falling towards the center. However, I think the best shot of the side might be this one, where you can see a pile of rusted metal on the bottom, with the side plating collapsing to the bottom, exposing a hole into the ship where it rusted through. Looking at that close in, this feels more like something on Titanic than a Pacific War wreck. In any case, though, we've reached the end of the video. Just a couple looks at what little remains of the stern to wrap it up. There's not a lot to talk about here, really. The stern was blown off before the ship sank, and that's very apparent on the bottom. It's a twisted mess of debris with basically nothing recognizable. and that applies to every angle, near or far. There might be the port shaft buried in debris here, but I can't be 100% certain. All I can say for sure is that the stern beyond this point is gone, and even here the deck is peeled up. That exposes some of the inner workings of the ship, but again there's not much recognizable debris in there. Though the last couple images are at least striking. From here, where the deck peels up and away, to where the deck has also peeled up here, including a bit out to the side, akin to the similar look on Indianapolis. And of course, the last image for today, where the deck has gone up and over the aft torpedo mount. When Yudachi's stern magazines went up, they did a number on the poor ship, to put it mildly, contributing today to such a badly corroded wreck on the bottom. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.